The final section of the presentation gets into the key policy choices, which this is the same presentation materials that we used at the public meetings. So you'll see that we were using a polling exercise, but these are the same questions that you'll be responding to with the online survey. Just a bit of context, these policy choices are building off of a lot of the work that's already been done on the plan, where we've talked to the community about what the countywide vision and shared values are. You can see here that based on earlier survey results, there's generally pretty strong support for the vision statement in that blue box, and then really strong support for those three sort of shared values that we identified earlier in the process. We also have talked with the community quite a bit about some of the countywide goals. And you'll see here a mix of levels of support for different goals under each of those topic areas. And this is really why we're getting into this part of the survey and asking a little bit more about what direction makes sense to you going forward, is because in some cases there's, I think, mixed direction in terms of whether people support or oppose different countywide goals, and even in areas where there's pretty strong support and some community consensus on what people think a good goal looks like, there still are different ways of approaching achieving that goal. So that gets into some of the survey questions you'll be answering. You'll notice as you're going through the survey, they're grouped into several categories: growth management, agriculture, crucial wildlife habitat, renewable energy, utility facilities and communication facilities, housing, and then economic development and tourism. I'll give you a little bit of background on each of those topics as we go through. I'll also just highlight for you that there are specific tools that we're highlighting to put on the table, and there may be some variation in terms of what actually gets adopted, but in terms of the categories that those fall under, there's policy direction, which really is what language should we be including in the land use plan to help achieve a certain goal. What regulatory tools should we look at, should the county be looking at in terms of achieving these goals? Often that would be in the development regulations. And then lastly, programs. What sorts of things should the county be working either internally or in partnerships with others, different state and federal agencies, with cities and other local governments in order to achieve the goals outlined in the plan. And then the other thing to highlight is you'll notice that each of the questions generally asks you whether you support a limited, moderate, or proactive approach on that topic. Really the limited is the most restrained, with limited changes, kind of more so the status quo of what the county is doing today. The moderate approach sort of highlighting some stronger tools that the county could use, but not necessarily diving too deep into the county being involved in trying to solve an issue. And then lastly, there's a proactive approach, and that sort of is saying that this issue is so important that we really need to look at everything that we can and try as many things as possible to address this challenge. And you'll notice as each of the survey questions will show you, each of those different sections, there's some specific things listed in there, and really I think for the purpose of this exercise at this point in the process, we want you to think a little bit more generally about, do you think generally it's limited, generally proactive? You may agree or disagree with specific language within each, but we do want to start getting an idea of where the community thinks the county should be focusing and putting more effort. This question was just a way for us to test the polling devices in the public meetings, and if you're curious, the answer is A, hey. This part of the survey, you'll notice, similar to how the survey was set up, we want to know where people live so that we can see if there's differences in opinion about what people think the county should be doing in different areas of the county. All right, so the first topic is growth management. At this point, we have presented a few of the preliminary policies to residents of the county, and we've gotten a lot of feedback about what makes sense and what doesn't. So this really gets into that issue of balancing growth management and property rights, getting into water and the role that that plays in where growth occurs. And in general, at this point, the public feedback that we've received so far thinks that, for the most part, these policies generally make sense. We'd like a little bit more from you all in this survey. So a little bit of context. The current 1998 land use plan in terms of growth management really highlights the importance of managing where growth happens, where development occurs, and really focusing that in and near the cities like Cody, Powell, and Meeteetse, and sort of suggest that there should be regulations that help achieve that. The reality is there's a bit of a disconnect between that and what the current regulations request and require. So a lot of areas will, in Park County, allow 1 acre lots or smaller when you're close to the cities and infrastructure, but also there's a lot of areas where you can have 1 acre lots far away from infrastructure and the cities. And so that's sort of a place where we're noticing there's some disconnect, and we'd like feedback. A way to illustrate this is looking at the current zoning regulations. This is the zoning map, and you'll notice that a lot of these areas that are orange in Meeteetse local, as well as GRP, which is the designation in a lot of the Powell and Cody Powell rural area, those allow 1 acre lots. So a property could be subdivided down to about 1 acre parcels. Obviously, that won't happen everywhere, but those areas and other areas that allow for subdivision down to 1 acre or less account for 55% of all of this privately owned land in Park County. And if everything was subdivided down to that 1 acre lot size, that would be capacity for over 424,000 housing units. So because of low suitability in a lot of areas, obviously there would not be 424,000 housing units built, and we wouldn't expect all those areas to be subdivided down to 1 acre lots. But it does sort of show that disconnect between what the plan is looking for and what the code and the regulations currently allow. How that looks in different areas varies. In those red areas on the map where there's high demand and suitability, there's actually almost unlimited capacity because there's so much potential there for subdivision down to 1 acre lots. In other areas, demand and capacity vary in those yellow areas, depending on what lot sizes are available. But Meeteetse local is another place where 1 acre lots would sort of allow almost unlimited capacity, even though there's not really very suitable land for development at that scale. And then those green areas sort of have low demand and limited capacity because it's already requires pretty large lots and there's not as much development pressure. The survey that you're taking and a lot of the questions that folks at the public meetings were able to respond to really ask, what should the county do? How involved should the county be in addressing each of these challenges? So for growth management, we're really trying to get an idea of generally where you fall on the scale of the level of county involvement in trying to address change, and maybe limited approach for growth management would be more of a status quo approach of encouraging growth to occur closer to cities, but not necessarily having a lot of regulations that focus on that issue. There we could look at some regulatory tools, like maybe requiring instead of encouraging conservation subdivisions, which allow people to redevelop the same number of units that they would be allowed in their zoning district. If they have 4 acres and they're allowed to subdivide into 1 acre lots, they could still get four houses to be built there, but the county would allow or require, in this case, them to put all those 4 units on smaller parcels and then conserve the rest of the land as production agriculture. A moderate approach would look at more adjusting those minimum lot sizes, as we talked about. Currently, lots of the county allows 1 acre minimum lot sizes. People can subdivide down to 1 acre, but this would sort of adjust it and sort of say when you're closer to cities and infrastructure, that makes sense. But when you're farther away from cities and infrastructure, that doesn't make sense, and those should be larger lots. And then also looking at programs with the cities to find ways to encourage density and development to occur closer to cities. And then the proactive approach would sort of build on both of those. So all of the limited policies and regulations, and the moderate policy regulations, and in addition, some of the other tools that would be explored under a proactive approach would be to actually limit subdivisions in areas where they're far from cities and infrastructure, with the caveat that there are a lot of limitations in state law in terms of what the county can and can't let people do in terms of subdivision. There's some subdivisions that the county doesn't have control over. But otherwise, they could really encourage development near cities to annex and work with cities on annexation plans so that when there are big developments that come in near cities, the county would sort of work with the cities to encourage those developments to annex where they have access to city infrastructure. So the question that you'll be answering is similar to this question that folks at the public meetings were answering. And we're asking for whether you prefer a limited, moderate, or proactive approach. And then you'll also notice that you can provide some comments or select other if you have other ideas in terms of what you think makes sense. And this leads us into agriculture, which I will go through a little bit more quickly because it's similar to the growth management in terms of the current regulations and policy guidance. Generally, we heard a lot of support from the public so far that protecting most important agricultural lands is really important. And so this is sort of helping us know, if this is important, what do you think we should do about it? The current plan says we should protect agricultural lands and agricultural businesses, but the regulations don't necessarily line up with that vision. There is an agricultural overlay, but it doesn't totally align well with irrigated agricultural lands, which are identified as the most important. And then also because the county allows 1 acre lot subdivisions in so much of the county right now, there's, I think, a disconnect in terms of protecting agricultural land from being developed. This map sort of shows where those irrigated agricultural lands are in the light blue, and then that hashing black on the map sort of shows where the agricultural overlay is, and you'll see that that doesn't totally line up with where the most important agriculture is. So that's something that would probably be, the county is probably looking at updating that just so that those line up, I think, regardless of which approach folks select and want to move forward with. So area-specific considerations in those red areas, it's not only where we're anticipating the most development pressure, because that's where most development has occurred in recent years, but it's also where the most valuable agricultural lands are. So that's really where there's a huge overlap and conflict. In the yellow areas, there's kind of a mix. Some areas like Clark, the Middle and Lower South Fork have a lot more agriculture, and some level of development pressure, especially in the lower South Fork. And then other areas like North Fork, Meeteetse, there's not as much agricultural land, and there's varying levels of demand for development and suitability. And then those green areas, once again, already have large lots, so there's not as much conflict with development and agriculture, and there's not as much agriculture in general, so much public land. So what policy options make sense? Again, just trying to get a feel for generally what you're comfortable with in terms of what role the county plays, whether you think limited, sort of encouraging clustering of development on marginal parts of agricultural land where it's less productive, and reviewing development that falls within that agriculture overlay to sort of recommend to people coming in with developments that they don't impact agriculture. A moderate approach would additionally look at changes to minimum lot sizes in certain areas, increasing the minimum lot size that's required in areas like the agricultural overlay, so that people would not be subdividing into as small of lots. And then probably also looking at requiring the use of conservation subdivisions and having additional development standards that sort of would create buffers between maybe what's being developed for residential housing and those working agricultural lands. And then finally, a proactive approach would look at really limiting subdivisions and residential developments within the agricultural overlay, and working with land conservation organizations to get help landowners put more land into conservation easements. And also the county could look at a program where they're actually purchasing those highest value agricultural lands for preservation, and that would be not something that gets created right now, but that would sort of say, hey, the county should really look at doing everything possible to look at how we can protect agricultural lands. So that's the explanation for those, and just like you are responding on the survey, folks at the public meetings were able to respond and sort of vote on this question. For the crucial wildlife habitat, it's actually pretty similar to agriculture. We heard a lot of support for protecting crucial wildlife habitat. The current land use plan does say that the county should encourage the preservation of crucial wildlife habitats and have building regulations that sort of balance when development is in these areas where there's crucial wildlife habitat and limiting its impacts. The development regulations don't necessarily identify where those crucial wildlife habitats are, so that kind of limits how this this vision that the community has can be applied. And then there's not really a lot of regulations that focus on how to limit the impact of development on crucial wildlife habitat. This is a look at what an overlay might look like. This is the crucial elk habitat only, and we're working with Game and Fish and other sort of public agencies to identify where other crucial habitat exists, and so this would not necessarily be exactly where this overlay would apply, but it does sort of give you an idea of what that might look like. And so this is a placeholder for now that we're looking. In specific areas, those red areas, there's actually not a lot of crucial wildlife habitat, but there is a lot of development pressure. So development has a lot of potential to impact crucial wildlife habitat where it exists, even though it's limited. In the yellow areas, there's actually quite a bit of crucial wildlife habitat, but it's not in the areas that are the most suitable for development. It tends not to be in areas near like Meeteetse or near infrastructure. In the North Fork, however, there is a huge overlap between where crucial wildlife habitat is and where private lands that could be developed are. And then in those green areas, there's really extensive public lands. There's a lot of really great, high value, crucial wildlife habitat. But because there's not a lot of development pressure and there's large lots required, there's not expected to be that much impact on crucial wildlife habitat. So what policy options make sense? Similar to the growth management and agricultural question, the limited approach would look at sort of encouraging the use of conservation to conserve those crucial wildlife habitats, maybe create that overlay district that sort of identifies where the most important wildlife habitat is, and say, hey, if you're going to develop in those areas, we'd really like it if you did conservation subdivisions or used limited amount of land so that more land is available for wildlife to move. The moderate approach would additionally require the use of conservation subdivisions within the wildlife overlay, so not just recommending it, and also look at things like wildlife-friendly fencing and other design standards that could minimize the impact of development on wildlife. And then finally, the proactive approach would additionally limit the number of subdivisions and residential developments within the wildlife overlay, probably in part by having larger lot sizes so that it would be harder to do subdivisions and redevelop those areas, but also working in partnership with cities and land preservation organizations and different organizations that are involved in identifying and protecting crucial wildlife habitat to look at how they can work with landowners to place land into conservation easements, and maybe even look at purchasing pieces of land that are really important to wildlife habitat or movement corridors and protecting that. So here's the question that you'll be answering in the survey, whether you want a limited, moderate, or proactive approach. And moving into large-scale renewable energy and communication facilities, this is looking at large-scale wind, large-scale solar. Again, those are not things that people would do individually on their property, like if somebody had a wind turbine that sort of serves their own property, or if they have solar panels on their roof. That's not really what we're asking about here. It's really looking at large-scale projects. And so that's a good place to have your mind thinking about in terms of what makes sense to you. And then additionally, cell towers and infrastructure for internet and broadband. Where does that make sense? Currently, the land use plan really encourages all of this type of development, whether it's renewable or non-renewable energy sources, telecommunications and other communications facilities. The plan says, yes, we want it. We would like to see that. The development regulations provide a little bit of limitation already. So the state has established minimum standards for a lot of wind and solar facilities. And so they are already requiring a certain amount of regulation that limits where these types of developments occur. Additionally, Park County has some siting standards for where wind facilities can be located based on their size. And they also require a special use permit for these major utility facilities in all areas. So that requires a public hearing and opportunities for people in Park County to weigh in. So there is some regulation on these already. I will note that a lot of the regulations so far are really focused on wind facilities, but not solar. So we're curious to hear what you think about that. In terms of how this varies by different parts of Park County, the red areas like Cody and Powell and the areas around there have a lot of the population and the growth potential. It means that they are potentially have the most conflict with this sort of thing in terms of more people being in proximity to large-scale renewable energy and communication facilities. It also tends to be, along with the Meeteetse area, along a pretty major utility corridor that goes north and south through Park County up into Montana. And so that's probably just logically an area where there would be more interest in developing wind and solar, since it's along that transmission line. There's not a lot of transmission lines in the mountainous areas that are green, as well as North Fork and Clark and Middle South Fork, Lower South Fork. So potentially less impact there, but I think that we definitely, doesn't mean that it couldn't happen. So we want to hear your thoughts. In terms of the policy options, I'm going to ask you specifically about each one of those categories: wind, solar, and communication facilities, but each would have policy options that fall into one of these three approaches. The limited would really be generally a status quo approach using the existing state standards, but maybe also looking at additional standards that the county can have for large-scale wind facilities and communication towers. A moderate approach would also look at identifying areas where these sorts of facilities would have the largest impact, and really requesting but not requiring that large-scale solar and wind facilities and communication towers be sited so that they minimize impacts. And then the proactive approach would look at adopting standards that really require those same standards to be applied to minimize impacts. So instead of requesting under a moderate approach, the proactive approach would require that. And then we'd like to know, in terms of wind facilities, what specifically makes sense for Park County, separately for solar facilities, and then lastly, communication towers. Think about cell towers.
Also heard a lot about housing through this process, and there are mixed opinions about whether the county's involvement in the housing market should be more or less, but there's also significant concern about the lack of affordable housing and senior housing more generally. We've also heard interest in potentially pursuing a conversation about building code. Since the 1998 plan, there have also been some other emerging issues that have arisen related to housing that really weren't on the radar at the time. So based on the trends that we've seen, where we have a lot of new residents moving to the area, a lot of those folks are older retirees or remote workers. And we've also seen a large increase in the number of short-term rental units in the county. So since the county did their initial listening sessions on this topic back in 2019, there's actually been an increase of 66% of the total number of units in the county. So a pretty big change over a short period of time. And along with that, we have heard concerns related to, again, affordability and the impacts of the transitioning of kind of permanent housing units to short-term rentals is having on the economy and also on the workforce. So in terms of where the county is today on housing, the 1998 plan definitely supports many of the concepts that we've heard in terms of encouraging opportunities for affordable housing, providing safe and diverse housing, but it also makes it pretty clear that the provision of housing units is really something that is the role of the private sector. And so focusing the county's role on kind of looking at the type, location, and quality of housing. And the development regulations do provide some flexibility. For example, accessory housing units are permitted in all districts except for industrial, so those are kind of a secondary unit. There are opportunities for employee housing and mobile homes, and you do have some opportunity for multifamily housing through a special use permit in Tsetse and close to Cody and Powell. And so there's really this effort to strike a balance between kind of what the county's role is and isn't, but there, as I mentioned earlier, there is no guidance related to short-term rentals, and so that's something that needs to be considered in this process. So So in terms of where the housing considerations really play out geographically, obviously we see the biggest demand for workforce housing in the red areas, Cody Powell Rural, Powell, Cody Local, and Sage Creek. And this is also where we're actually seeing a lot of short-term rentals and seasonal rentals. And so the concerns about kind of the transition of the housing stock to non-residents is a particular concern in their areas. We're also seeing growth in some of those uses, the short-term rentals in areas like the North Fork and even in Clark. In terms of policy options for housing, on the limited end of the spectrum, we'd really be focusing on just using some targeted zoning amendments to support the general direction of encouraging more dense housing near the cities and kind of discouraging that type of pattern in areas that have poor suitability and poor access. In the moderate approach, we would probably go a little bit further in terms of where those changes might be happening and really focusing in adjacent to the cities so that we have denser housing options close to the cities and probably quite a bit more variation in the types of lot sizes that are allowed depending on access and suitability. And then in the proactive approach, we would really be looking at kind of trying to create more city level services adjacent to the cities, city level standards adjacent to the cities for those denser developments so that if and when they are annexed in the future, it is a efficient and cost-effective possibility. In terms of regulatory tools, we could also be looking at the potential for special districts for larger and denser subdivisions. So that would be a means of looking at ensuring that those developments are able to contribute in terms of their impact to county services from a financial standpoint. And this option also is where we have highlighted the potential for a uniform building code. We will have a separate question on that, but just letting you know that's kind of where that falls. First question on housing focuses primarily on how the county should be involved in addressing housing diversity. And so the limited option in this case focuses primarily on some targeted zoning updates to require areas, larger lots in areas where we have poor suitability or access to services. So essentially kind of a reverse focus of getting smaller lots close to close to services. And the moderate option would kind of intensify that. So we'd have more opportunities for smaller lots, greater diversity of housing types in areas that are close to the cities and that have good access to services. And then the proactive option, we would go so far as to potentially require denser, more varied housing near the cities and establish stronger standards in these areas to match or mirror city standards. So kind of a progressive approach in terms of pretty light touch to a very proactive strategy. And that would be done obviously in collaboration with the cities.
This question asks what role Park County should play in addressing housing needs. And instead of doing the limited and moderate and proactive approach, there's a few specific things outlined here for you to weigh in on. The first option, A, is to work with municipalities and other partners to address public housing needs. That might be something like identifying pieces of land that are not being used that the county can contribute towards maybe a nonprofit organization or a local business that wants to build housing for employees. Some way, finding a way to partner there. Option B would be to actually invest county funds in the development of more affordable housing types. Option C would be to explore requiring that special districts would would be required for some of the larger and denser subdivisions. That's a way to sort of offset the costs to the county and taxpayers as a whole by having some newer subdivisions that can provide, maybe their own sewer or water system for their subdivision. Option D on the public meeting was to allow some sort of combination of all of those. On the survey online, you'll be able to select things individually. Option E would be none, to not do any of those things. And option F is if you're not sure or have no opinion. So this last question in terms of housing sort of responds to something that we've heard a little bit about through the process, and essentially asking if you think it's worthwhile for the county to look into what the costs and benefits would be of adopting a uniform building code. And the uniform building code is something that is not required now, but it would include things like inspection of porches and decks, windows, that sort of thing, in terms of safety, which is currently not required, and it would be expected to, increase the cost of a building permit and potentially require additional county staff. At this point, we just want to know if you think it's worth looking into what those costs would be and potential benefits, since at this point that's not a very well-known number. This next topic looks into short-term rentals, things like Airbnbs and VRBOs. Essentially, seeing if it makes sense to you for the county to adjust the way that deals with it now. Currently, there's not really a type of regulation or regulatory approach that is specifically dealing with short-term rentals. This wasn't something that the 1998 plan has dealt with. And I think the limited approach here would sort of continue that, where the county doesn't really regulate where VRBOs and Airbnbs occur in the county, but would sort of start keeping track of where those rental units are located and how many there are, just to allow the county to adapt and maybe look at policy or regulatory changes down the road. The moderate approach would look at more clearly defining what short-term rentals are in the zoning and regulations, and then looking at some regulatory tools, like maybe establishing a registration program where folks that are operating an Airbnb or VRBO need to get a permit from the city just to make sure that their unit is registered, but not really have any regulations beyond that. And then the more proactive approach here would be to actually restrict or cap the number of short-term rentals in some areas where there tend to be more of them. That's something that actually the city of Cody does. They've established a few districts where you're not allowed to have short-term rentals. Some areas of town where you can have there can be as many short-term rentals as fit, and then there's others where there's a cap on the total number of short-term rentals that are allowed. The regulatory tools under the proactive option could sort of reflect something like that, maybe even have fees for short-term rentals to offset the impacts that they have on county services and infrastructure, and maybe even restrict where short-term rentals occur in the county.
So as far as short-term rentals, I think we are really looking for your input at this stage on whether you want to kind of keep things the way they are, but potentially start tracking how many active rentals we have using the data that we've provided and kind of carrying that forward. Whether you think there should be more oversight on short-term rentals in terms of registration, some specific code language to kind of get at short-term rentals in different contexts and that sort of thing. And then whether you think the county should be really proactive in this area. Should there be some sort of cap? Is there a reason or a desire by the community to look at limitations or fees or other strategies to try to do this. And the question is not at all intended to imply that short-term rentals would go away. It's really just how you think they should be addressed by the county moving forward. Our final topic is economic development and tourism. There have been mixed opinions so far on whether the county should play a stronger role in economic development. There are a couple of organizations that focus on that for the county as a whole currently. We've also heard support for and against expanding recreational opportunities and tourism related uses in the county, and a desire to reduce the seasonality of both tourism and agricultural industries in Park County. So in terms of where the 1998 land use plan comes down on economic development and tourism, it takes a pretty light touch, generally providing support for and encouraging support for existing businesses and industries, specifically ag businesses, and support for diversifying business and industry, but doesn't really get too deep in terms of what the county's role should be. The 2021 Natural Resources Management Plan, which deals with public lands in the county and the interface with county government, is really generally just supports the multiple use of public lands and kind of continuing to build on that. The development regulations are really varied by planning area. And there are very few areas in the unincorporated portions of the county that are actually zoned for commercial and industrial uses. So there are supportive uses allowed in other zoning districts, but we're talking about areas that are specifically zoned for commercial or industrial. So economic development and tourism opportunities as they stand today really vary depending on where you are in the county. Obviously, kind of from a public land standpoint, depending on the areas on the western side of the county have more public lands. We have more of our service hubs in the Powell and Cody area, and then kind of a variation of different levels of services and recreational amenities in some of the other areas. So the policy options for economic development and tourism, specifically related to commercial businesses on the limited end of the spectrum, essentially means, we want to continue to have the county should have a fairly light touch. We want to continue to support the businesses that we do have and sustain agricultural activity, but we don't really want to change much in terms of the regulations that we have in place currently. So if you like the range of options you have in your zoning now and you don't want to see it change, a limited option is probably comparable to what your direction might be. If you are interested in seeing some additional options in your area in terms of the types of business activity that could be allowed, you might want to see happen in your area, then I would lean more towards a moderate approach. And so that is going to be potentially expanding the range of uses that are available in your planning area. And then the proactive approach means that the county would proactively seek to attract or direct businesses to designated areas. And by that we mean that there would be new areas zoned specifically for commercial or industrial uses. Right now there are very few areas in the county that have actual commercial zoning or industrial zoning. And so this would be saying, not only do we want to provide more flexibility for uses, we're going to designate some actual geographies where we want to direct those types of businesses. So that would be both from a plan standpoint and the existing and the updated regulations.
So in the survey, we want to know from you what the county should be doing or thinking about in terms of commercial businesses. The limited approach, supporting the existing amount of commercial businesses that are in the unincorporated areas of the county that's outside of the cities and towns. The moderate approach would actually allow more commercial activity in certain areas, and particularly with a focus on agriculture related businesses. And then C, a proactive approach would be to actually start looking at attracting commercial businesses and development, whether that's with business parks or designating certain areas of the county as commercial that aren't today, as a way to increase the amount of commercial activity in the county.
So there are two issues and opportunities that have kind of come up related to outdoor recreation that we have questions about, and these are the last two questions we're going to ask you. One is related to public lands access where it exists currently, so where you have existing trailheads and parking areas. And there have been conflicts in the past about between new subdivisions and if you share an access road to a trailhead, that there have been challenges related to that. So the policy options here related to access really focus on, are we comfortable with just encouraging the access and not being able to really be more explicit about that? Or would we like to see more specific access regulations to maintain that existing access? And we'll talk more about that when we get to the question. The second piece is related to outdoor recreational uses. And so we've heard from some planning areas that there have been concerns about new campgrounds or hotels that are proposed, RV parks. Those types of requests are coming into the county all the time. And so we're interested in hearing from you whether you think those types of uses should be expanded in your planning area or not, and also whether the county should play a role in other types of projects that might expand recreational uses for local residents. And so a couple examples here that have come up. One is that there is a potential project being looked at to create a rails to trails connection between Cody and Powell. And we've also heard about a project that's being explored in partnership with the BLM to establish a new trail outside of Powell. And so the question is really related to the how active do you think the county should be in those types of efforts? So for the questions, we'll break it into two questions. The first is, what approach to public land access makes the most sense for Park County? So option A is that basically status quo, continue to encourage existing access be maintained if someone comes in and builds next to it, but not getting more explicit in your regulations. The moderate approach would be that you would require the existing access be maintained in your regulations when adjacent development occurs. And then C builds on that and says, not only do we want to require it, we also want to pursue opportunities to expand access in partnership with others. So our last question is, what approach to outdoor recreation makes the most sense for Park County? Option A would mean basically pretty hands-off. The county is going to continue to work with state and federal entities on public land access and projects and kind of management as they have for many, many years. And this is also the most, and also limit more intensive recreational uses on private land in certain planning areas. And that would really be dictated, kind of informed by what we hear from you. So if you think that you don't want to see more of a certain type of recreational use, whether it's a campground or RV park, those types of uses, then select A and be sure to let us know what specific uses you're most concerned about. And B would be looking to actually expand some of those opportunities in certain locations. So this is another case where we need to hear from you what you'd like to see in your planning area. So if you think that having some of those recreational attractions and businesses in your area makes sense, and that's something you'd like the county to take a slightly more active role in, that's something that you would then you could select option B. And then C means that the county would provide more diverse options based on what we hear from the planning areas in terms of zoning allowances, but they would also be partners in the expansion and potentially investing in outdoor recreation amenities. So whether that's a new trail, a new access point, that you think the county should play a bigger role in expanding outdoor recreational opportunities.